objectivity went out the window in Yugoslavia, and that's very much with us today. So much of what, if you look back at Yugoslavia, both the tone and the substance, so much of this evokes what's happening now in Ukraine. Again, the disparaging of negotiations. Okay, you don't negotiate with evil men. You pulverize them through military force. There's also a personalization. In the Cold War, it was never personalized. It was communism we were fighting with. All right. Even under Stalin, it was never, we're fighting Joseph Stalin. That wasn't done. That wasn't said. All right. But with the end of the Cold War, you had incredible simplification of analysis that why do we have problems in the world? There are evil men out there with names like Milosevic or Gaddafi or Putin. All right. And so because you have these evil men who come just out of nowhere, out of pure evil, no social context, no depth of analysis, nothing, evil men. It's amazing people, educated people would talk this way, but of course they did and do on a regular basis today.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. David Gibbs, a professor of history at Arizona University. David has been working on the history of Yugoslav wars, and since June 12th was the 26th anniversary of NATO's intervention in Kosovo, we thought we should discuss this event when the alliance, for the first or second time, set foot outside its territory. So, David, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for this discussion that we can have, because you actually had the idea to that we should discuss this, since Kosovo was such a pivotal moment, not just for the end of the breakup of Yugoslavia or the final stages, but also for the further development of NATO. And just before talking, you actually corrected me and said, look, Kosovo wasn't the first time. There was an intervention also before in Bosnia, but Kosovo was very pivotal for NATO. Can you maybe expand on that?
Sure. The intervention in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo obviously were part of the breakup of Yugoslavia, which began in 1991. There was um, a civil war in Bosnia that led to a NATO intervention there, a NATO air war, Operation Deliberate Force. That was a relatively brief duration against the Serbs. It was U.S. and NATO consistently operated against the Serbs. Well, which is interesting, by the way. The question would be, why did we operate against the Serbs? And I think there is a good answer to that, which is that in the end of Yugoslavia's existence, they had elections in each republic. And the only republic that voted for the former Communist Party, renamed the Socialist Party, were the Serbs. Serbia voted for the Socialist Party. And so I think there was an anti-communist motive to some extent, seeing the Serbs as the last redoubt of communism in the Balkans. So I think that accounts to a significant degree for the animus towards the Serbs. The claim was that the Serbs had committed more of the atrocities. They did commit more of the atrocities, but I don't. There are a variety of reasons why I don't think humanitarian considerations were the main motive here. The main motive at first was an anti-communist one, to make sure that communism was finished once and for all. But then it evolved into a much larger motive in both Bosnia and in Kosovo, which was to give a new justification for NATO. Kosovo was more significant in this respect because this was a 78-day air war of substantial duration. And it was the main method through which NATO intervened in Kosovo. In Bosnia, it was more complicated because there was ground forces supplied by the Croatian army. But in Kosovo, the main military operation was an air war, and that was NATO. And so this played a major role in again reaffirming that NATO had a quote unquote vital role to play in the post-Cold War world. The whole issue here was that in the end of the Cold War, it wasn't clear NATO had any purpose, and there was a widespread assumption NATO would just disappear because it had no purpose. There was another consideration too in this case, which is in the 90s, a forgotten chapter of history, was that Europe was showing a remarkable degree of independence. And this was a period when Europe was seriously considering an independent foreign policy. In other words, independent of the United States. The European Union, called the European Community, there was a serious consideration given to having it have a not only a foreign policy purpose, which it still has today, but one independent of the United States. Now, this is something that Charles de Gaulle had been calling for since the 1960s in France. But after the end of the Cold War, Germany increasingly warmed to the idea of an independent Europe. And since Germany and France had always been the motor of of the European Union, European community, there was a real possibility this could happen, and that Europe could um, have a place of its own. I think the logic was that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States indeed was a unipolar authority in the world. And it was thought that this was an unhealthy state of affairs, that the United States had a virtual dictatorship, almost, I mean, not a literal dictatorship, but it was able unilaterally to decide what happened on a global scale without any check on its power. And that was thought to be just an unhealthy situation. Europe, it was felt, could check American power. Individually, of course, none of the individual European countries could do so, but collectively, it was thought they could give the U.S. a run for its money, and 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 um, and check American unilateralism. With one more detail to this, which is the euro was emerging during this period. 1999, early 1999 is when the euro was first officially unveiled as the currency of central banks of Europe. It later replaced currencies completely a couple of years later, but 1999 was the inauguration of the euro, January 1. And there was a real fear in the United States. Europe would try to use this to reduce American economic power and the role of the dollar. And that was seen as a threat. It's remarkable to talk about this now because Europe had become such a toady of the United States now. It seems like a completely different world at this point, but it's important to remember this was not the case in the 1990s. And so the key here was that the United States saw NATO as an alternative to the EU. The idea was to emphasize NATO to an increasing degree as a way of undercutting Europe's effort at independence. And the Yugoslav wars, both Bosnia and then more importantly Kosovo, was the arena in which this was achieved. That Europe was trying to assert. Well, I'm sorry. Let me stop for a moment here and see if you have any questions.
No, I mean this is very important because the what you're doing is you connect the grand strategic level with well, I mean I want to call it tactical, but it's a bit harsh to call the entire Yugoslav affair a tactical war. But then again, if you look at the way that these unfolded or could have be dealt with otherwise, it looks as if there was some tactics behind it, because we know, the United States branded itself also as the peace bringer, right, with Dayton, Ohio, the Dayton Agreement. But those agreements could have been achieved years earlier. They were in the making. And could you maybe connect that a little bit with what you just said about the about NATO as a replacement for the EU?
Yes, I will do that. I guess one of the points I do want to make, though, is Kosovo was the place that killed European independence. I mean, it ended after the Kosovo War. The idea is military victory established that you can't beat the Americans, and if you can't beat them, you should join them. And that's what the Europeans did. That's what we have today. I just wanted to make that basic point. I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Please repeat the question for me.
So the role of the United States first as as being an obstruction to a inner Yugoslav arrangement and settlement, and then bringing basically the agreement that had been made earlier a few years later after a lot of bloodshed.
Yes, good, good. Okay. In the case of Kosovo, I mean, I'm going to go into in detail, is that the way the European Union tried to assert its power and its independence was to broker a peaceful settlement through negotiation of the Kosovo issue, of the conflict in Kosovo. They almost did that. And they established the basis for a peaceful settlement. And it was torpedoed by the United States because they wanted to establish no one is going to settle this, but the United States through NATO. We're not going to let the Europeans get the credit for that, because if they do, that will enable them basically to establish themselves as a pole of independent power in Europe and in the world. We don't want that. And so the US torpedoed the European efforts. The irony of this is that it led to a war with thousands of deaths. And then the United States imposed a peace settlement that looked remarkably like what the Europeans had already achieved before the NATO war. It was almost identical to the European plan.
Can
And
you give
so
us the details? Can you give the details of that plan and when was it?
why don't I, I'm going to march through the details. What I'd like to do is first give the background to the Kosovo conflict. The bottom line, of course, is Kosovo was then not quite, nobody had heard of Kosovo. Nobody knew a goddamn thing about Kosovo, which is perfect because the propaganda opportunities are limitless. If no, the public is a blank slate, so you can tell them anything you want to tell them, which of course was done. Um, and so Kosovo was an autonomous region of Yugoslavia, essentially the same. Yugoslavia was divided into 8 regions, and Kosovo was one of them. It was inhabited predominantly by ethnic Albanians, ethnically and linguistically the same as those in the Republic of Albania next door, but also a very sizable Serb minority. And there had been heavy tension between the Serbs and the Albanians, with the Albanians lower levels significant. Kosovo was the least developed part of Yugoslavia, and the Albanians were the poorest people in Yugoslavia. Um, and they really were culturally oppressed up until 1966. In 1966, there was a political shakeup in Yugoslavia, and the interior minister was fired by Tito. And a new policy was undertaken whereby cultural autonomy was given to Kosovo and its status was elevated. And the Albanians were given effective control of the territory for the first time ever. And the Albanian language was promoted to a significant degree. And the tables were turned, and the Kosovo Albanians increasingly began to persecute the Serb minority. And there was significant degree of discrimination and harassment and outmigration of Serbs over time glacially from Kosovo. And in the 1980s, there was a survey of I looked at the press and during this period, and there was coverage of it in the Western media. And the terms like ethnic cleansing were talked about in terms of Serbs being ethnically cleansed through harassment and discrimination. Not really so much violence, but harassment and discrimination. And there's also a 1989 study in the American Sociological Review of ethnic intolerance in Yugoslavia and found that the most intolerant part of Yugoslavia was Kosovo, and the most intolerant ethnic group of all the ethnic groups were the Albanians. All right. I say this just because the Albanians were presented as heroes during the later part of the Kosovo crisis, and the Serbs as as the villains. And it was more complicated than that, I guess, is what I'm suggesting. And that there was mutual hatred, and the Albanians had their share of hatred and discrimination as well. In 1989, with the breakdown of ethnic amity in Yugoslavia across the board, Slobodan Milosevic established essentially ended the autonomy of Kosovo and brought it under direct control of the Republic of Serbia under his control, and then began protecting the Serbs but persecuting the Albanians. And so again, the tables were turned once again against the Albanians this time. And the repression was significant, and there's no doubt that the repression was very real. And during the 1990s, you began to get the development of the Kosovo Liberation Army, um, which fought the repression through violence and through, it must be said, terrorism is a very loaded word, but for lack of a better word, terrorism, they would attack civilians, Serb civilians, and they had also a lot of involvement in criminality. Al-Qaeda seems to have also been involved with them. Um, and Osama bin Laden, I believe, played a direct role in helping to recruit people for the KLA. It was described in American sources as a terrorist organization. The State Department officially described it that way as a terrorist organization. Of course, later on, they became our selected army, basically, our ground forces in Kosovo, and they were, this was whitewashed and memory hold, you might say. But the bottom line is that the KLA were not nice people. Let's just put it that way. Even if the Serbs weren't very nice either. Neither side comes off very well here. There were no heroes. Villains, yes, but heroes, no. The problem accelerated In 1997, there was a civil war, a brief breakdown of authority in Albania, the Republic of Albania, and arms basically flooded into Kosovo. And then a real low-level civil war began, and Kosovo acquired the Kosovo Liberation Army acquired new weapons, and it began getting a real civil war. And then by 1998, 99, the United States became involved in it. And this led to more direct involvement, leading to the war itself. But before I give any more details, do you want to interject any questions?
We really need to get to the detail of this this peace agreement that the EU tried to broker, or the Europeans tried
All
to
right.
broker, and that was sabotaged.
Right, right. Well, before I want to note that basically in 1998, the United States actually itself brokered an agreement. Actually, it was a joint agreement. It was a German general, Klaus von Naumann, and Richard Holbrooke, a State Department official, jointly went as a joint delegation to broker a ceasefire. And basically, they threatened the Serbs with bombing and demanded the Serbs withdraw their security forces in a short period of time from Kosovo. And the Serbs agreed to this, and they withdrew their forces. Klaus von Naumann later on was a prosecution witness at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He was a prosecution witness against Milosevic, so nobody can call him pro-Serb. He repeatedly said, both in his cross-examination of the trial and also in interviews with the BBC, that Milosevic completely honored, virtually to the letter, this agreement. And it underscores the fact that the idea that you could not negotiate with Milosevic, he would not honor agreements, is false. He did honor this agreement. And every indication is he wanted to settle this without war. Every single indication is that's what he wanted to do. Um, and so that's an important point here because, again, it's contrary to the dominant narrative that you couldn't negotiate, that only violence, Milosevic only understands violence. It's not the case. It's not what the record shows at all. And von Naumann's testimony here it underscores this point. I guess one of the things I do want to note is one of the main features that comes across in this episode is the United States does not believe in negotiations. It believes in force, military force. Negotiations is for the weak. Norway can do negotiations if they want, you know. But the United States doesn't do that. The United States uses force, all right? But temporarily, there were negotiations. And all right, and so the United basically a political settlement, a permanent political settlement, was not yet established, and so France and Britain brought together the Serbs and the Kosovo Liberation Army to a castle outside of Paris called Rambouillet. And what they did is they brokered an agreement that involved internal self-rule for for Kosovo, a return to basically what they had before 1989, a withdrawal of Serb security forces that would remain in place, and a peacekeeping force would supervise. And the Serbs agreed basically to everything, and they were on the verge of concluding a deal. There was some difference of opinion as to who should do the peacekeeping, whereas France and Britain wanted NATO to do it, but the Serbs wanted the United Nations to have a UN peacekeeping force, and that was still a difference. But it was generally agreed by everybody, including Madeleine Albright, the U.S. Secretary of State, that the Serbs were completely ready and virtually agreed to almost all the political terms.
And that was in what? That was when?
It was early 1999.
Okay, so in the spring of 99.
That's right. And then basically at the last moment, a new condition was inserted. A military annex to the agreement was inserted. It had not been there before. Very likely this was written by General Wesley Clark, who was a top NATO general. All right. And it basically said, just in sort of parenthetically, that NATO forces would have the right to basically operate and essentially occupy not only all of Kosovo, but all of Serbia. Meaning Serbia would be almost like a defeated and occupied country. And this is a completely new condition. And that led to the complete breakdown of negotiations. The way it was presented was that after the Serbs read the military annex, they were, of course, appalled. And the European delegation met them for another routine meeting. And the Serbs said, I'll just quote it directly. They said, have you come to fuck us again? All right. Have you come to fuck us again? Well, that was the end of the negotiations. Clearly, they broke down after that. The Serb delegation left, and everybody began preparing for war. The question is, why was this inserted? How was this done? Well, we had new information on that because John Gilbert, who was the number 2 figure in the British Ministry of Defense, later testified before Parliament that it was done deliberately by the Americans to provoke basically a war because the Americans wanted to settle this through war. All right. They did not want to settle it peacefully. I should add that the British and French were not enthusiastic about this. Even the British were not enthusiastic. Normally, one thinks of the British as America's puppy dog. But in this case, the British basically resented the idea that the United States was trying to undermine the agreement. And when the United States proposed a bombing campaign, the British Foreign Minister Cook told Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, that our lawyers think you can't do this without a UN Security Council resolution authorizing it, which is true, of course. And that wouldn't happen because it would be vetoed by both Russia and China, who are on the Security Council. And Madeleine Albright simply responded, why don't you get new lawyers? Okay. If your lawyers basically say this isn't sufficient, get new lawyers. That's what we would do, underscoring how the United States is not very interested in international law or the United Nations. They regard both as a nuisance. Power is good enough from the American standpoint. That's a basic theme here, really, throughout this whole period. And so that led to a 78-day war led by NATO. But I see you want to ask a question.
Yeah, and these basically 3 months then of the bombing campaign, and during which then also, civilian infrastructure was targeted in Serbia, especially notoriously the TV station in Belgrade, killing the people who were working there at night, and NATO then, of course, euphemistically calling this just collateral damage. But the interesting thing is also that the people, especially in Britain, they kept saying that they had to bomb these civilian infrastructure because it was used to propagate the propaganda of Mr. Milosevic. So basically admitting that what they wanted is to curb the ability of Serbia to tell its side of the story, but maybe that goes too far. I mean, going already into the details, but the rationale for this was that we need to bring an end to Serbia's rule over Kosovo, or an end to the slaughter, right? That's how it was spun. Serbia is trying to slaughter Kosovo the way that Bosniaks were massacred back in Srebrenica. And can you maybe explain a little bit the narrative importance of Srebrenica, which happened several years earlier?
Well, that was the idea, was basically that the Bosnia War, which was at a much larger scale, 100,000 deaths on both sides, leading to the Srebrenica massacre of 8,000 mostly military-age males, unarmed military-age males, in the village of Srebrenica in 1995, helped to demonize the Serbs, and to some extent, understandably, the Serbs had committed much more of the atrocities than the other side. There's no doubt about that. And the claim is they're doing that same thing, Kosovo. Problem is that's not the case. First of all, the war was at a much smaller scale. The total number of deaths in the civil war up to the NATO bombing on both sides, civilian and military, was estimated at 2,000. Right, that was the standard number given, 2,000. This was a low-level war, right? Not a large-scale war. Also, one thing things we know now from I got this from the memoirs of Alastair Campbell, who was a chief aide to Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister. What Campbell said is British intelligence was showing that up until the war began, the attacks against civilians were equally being committed by the KLA, the Albanians, and by the Serbs. So the Serbs were not committing most of the atrocities up until this point in time. And again, the scale of killing was low across the board. And so the idea that this was some sort of mass killing, like, I don't know, the Nazi killing of the Jews or something, this was wildly, absurdly exaggerated, it must be said. But that's how it was presented. And again, the fact that nobody knew anything about Kosovo, nobody could find it in a map, made it very easy to impose a narrative, even if the narrative was false. And it's very hard to contest it because, again, there was no information.
And there were, I mean, there were just claims, very strong claims. And it must also be added that this was the first time since, yeah, I think it was the first time since the Second World War that the Germans again participated in a military campaign. And this was really tough to sell to the Germans, actually. And the way it was sold, it was actually then beautifully documented in a 2007 documentary. The English translated title would read, "It Began with a Lie." 1 hour documentary where the journalists really meticulously showed how the story about a killing field in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, of a football field, and that the Serbs are mass executing civilians there, how that was used in order to in Germany to justify that Germany needs to participate in a NATO mission, because Germany as a NATO member could have blocked this. Germany in 2003 actually blocked NATO from being the primary implementation force in Iraq, right? They didn't agree. That's why you had to have the coalition of the willing. But in 1999, they succeeded in selling the idea, no, it needs to be a NATO campaign, and Germany is part of it. Do you know something about this narrative?
Yeah, I do. Joschka Fischer was the foreign minister, not the prime minister, but the foreign minister. He was from the Green Party, and the Green Party had been steeped in pacifism. That's what it came out of the idea of anti-militarism. And Joschka Fischer, of course, had a radical student background back in the day. It was I don't know, student days in, I think, Frankfurt, and he basically argued strenuously for this war, declaring that it's Germany's mission to liberate the suffering people of Kosovo, the Albanians, and to prevent the new Auschwitz. I think that's how he put it, to prevent the new Auschwitz. And Auschwitz really had nothing to do with what was going on in Kosovo. It really didn't. This was a low-level, brutal war, but low level, and both sides were equally responsible. This is according to British intelligence. You can read it in the memoirs of the chief aide to of Tony Blair. He says so. And so basically, he sold a false narrative, one that was very appealing to the German people, evidently. And it really changed. It was a sea change in Germany, because until then, basically, Germany, of course, it had an army, it had a sizable army, but it had never been used outside of Germany's borders in combat since 1945. And there was a basic point that kind of a certain German caution in light of their past history, they wouldn't participate in combat outside of their borders. And here they were for the first time participating in combat outside of their borders. And this really changed. The change in Germany was of narrative, of discussion, was probably greater than any other country. But worldwide, that's not true worldwide. In Europe and the United States, in Euro America, if you want to use that term, there was a basic change on the political left, which was that the political left went from being anti-war to being more pro-war than the right. It was the right, basically, that showed some caution here. And you began getting a switcheroo, you might say, ideologically, with regard to the issue of militarism. Germany more than elsewhere, but really throughout Europe and in the United States. I saw this with my own eyes, and I remember it very clearly. People who'd been anti-war just a few years before now were the most enthusiastic advocates of war because we're saving innocent people from slaughter. Okay, it was the narrative. And that was very appealing on the left. There was a religious fervor to it. I remember the religious fervor and an intolerance of dissent and open discussion and debate that was very striking. It first began in Bosnia, and it really became into full flower in the Kosovo War. And so it was not just a German issue. I should have one more point about Germany that's of some interest, is that a major propaganda campaign was a claim made by the German Ministry of Defense that they had intelligence showing that the Serbs had a planned mass killing that was going to take place, and that was stopped by the NATO air campaign called Operation Horseshoe. That was the Serb name for it, Operation Horseshoe. And this was going to be a mass killing of Albanians, with some implication that it would be like a Holocaust of the Albanians. It was made up, and a German general later admitted the whole thing was made up. They never had any kind of intelligence pointing to this. And it was just a fabrication. Of course, the admission to this appeared in German in the German media. I don't believe it was ever appeared in the English language media, and it came out after the war was over. If the war was over, nobody cares. The lie is much more remembered. Even in some peer-reviewed journals, I believe there's an article in International Security, a major academic journal, which referenced Operation Horseshoe, not realizing it had been debunked in the German media by a former general.
This is one of the things that leaves me baffled, like that serious historians, I mean, making a mistake, believing something that's not true, or committing a mistake, that's one thing, but actually knowingly saying something that um, that that just didn't take place that way. And sorry, I have to make this little tiny little excursion here. When the war, Russo-Ukrainian war started, I published a short little piece in a historian journal. I'm kind of semi academic, semi popular, and the editors, our like historian colleagues actually literally wrote that Russia's incursion into Ukraine is the first time ever in history that a nuclear state attacks a non-nuclear neighbor. It's like, this is wrong on so many levels. I mean,
That's a very strange thing to say.
Soviet Union and Afghanistan, China and Vietnam, and
The U.S. in numerous cases in the Caribbean.
There you could at least say it's not a neighbor. It wasn't a direct neighbor. I mean, at least technically it would be correct, but it's just a strange thing to say. But this happens actually to even serious historians, because even, and maybe here we have to we can bring it back, because today the Yugoslav wars, they lasted from the early 90s to the late 90s to the early 2000s, right? It was a
91 to 99, yeah.
It was basically a 10-year period, and this period was pivotal for the development of NATO and everything. But when the Ukraine war started, the whole of Europe started pretending that this is the first land war in Europe since 45. Do you remember this? Like, how often this was repeated?
Well, that's true. I mean, there are all sorts of things about Ukraine basically that are very striking. I remember that at the beginning of unprovoked war, I believe I Googled unprovoked war or unprovoked aggression, and hundreds of thousands of times it was said. And if you just, look at the number of hits in terms of the Google search engine. And this was something that just became almost a requirement at the beginning of the war to say unprovoked war. I think one of the things you had that came out of Yugoslavia is that up until Yugoslavia, academics and journalists had to at least pretend to be objective. All right. They couldn't openly, of course, they would often disseminate propaganda covertly in all sorts of ways, but they had to pretend they were not propagandists. And they couldn't openly say, I'm propagandist on behalf of one side. This broke down in the 1990s. In the 1990s, you had journalists and academics who would openly be cheerleaders for one side in the war. And people who weren't cheerleaders were denounced. And you have journalists openly saying that, no, I'm not objective. I'm trying to promote, the anti-Serbian side. I'm trying to promote intervention. They would openly be saying this. In the past, again, journalists did this all the time, but they didn't. They had a pretense, at least, that they weren't. They were being objective. Objectivity went out the window in Yugoslavia, and that's very much with us today. So much of what, if you look back at Yugoslavia, both the tone and the substance, so much of this evokes what's happening now in Ukraine. Again, the disparaging of negotiations. Okay, you don't negotiate with evil men. You pulverize them through military force. There's also a personalization. In the Cold War, it was never personalized. It was communism we were fighting with. All right, even under Stalin, it was never we're fighting Joseph Stalin. That wasn't done. That wasn't said. All right. But with the end of the Cold War, you had incredible simplification of analysis. That why do we have problems in the world? There are evil men out there with names like Milosevic or Gaddafi or Putin. All right. And so because you have these evil men who come just out of nowhere, out of pure evil, no social context, no depth of analysis, nothing, evil men. It's amazing educated people would talk this way, but of course they did and do on a regular basis today. And because of this inherent evil, you can't negotiate. Negotiating with them is itself rewarding evil. That shows you're an immoral person if you want to negotiate. You're compromising with evil. You have to defeat evil, destroy evil. Well, we did that in Yugoslavia, in Kosovo. We defeated Milosevic. And then after Milosevic, because we had to defeat him, we then had almost the same plan the Europeans had proposed and had virtually accepted by both sides, virtually identical before the war. As a result, about 10,000 people died. The scale of Serb atrocities massively increased during the war. The amount of atrocities hugely increased. It didn't save people, it killed people, the intervention. The whole idea is it saved people. It didn't do anything of the sort. It did the opposite. The ethnic cleansing massively increased during the bombing. So it didn't have any humanitarian um, accomplishments. It completely failed at every level in terms of humanitarianism. Whatever the motive, and you can get to the motive in a moment here. Even at the moment, even if we accept that the motive was humanitarian, I don't, but even if you accept that, um, good intentions aren't enough. I mean, the outcome was a disaster from a humanitarian standpoint. And then after the war was over, you had mass ethnic cleansing of Serbs, the Serbs who lived there, by the Albanians, right under NATO's nose, okay, without any complaint from NATO. Um, Anyway, so the effect of this was completely contrary to the stated objective, which is to protect people from persecution and to save lives.
But it's as sad as it is, it's the narrative that worked. And that fascinates me today is that for many Europeans, these 10 years of Yugoslavia are currently basically wiped out of the memory, and the only places where it remains is the assurance that it was the intervention that saved people.
That's right.
And
That's right.
defeating Milosevic and him finally, admitting guilt by hanging himself in The Hague, which is a very, very murky thing.
He had a heart attack.
Hmm?
Heart attack. It was a heart attack.
A heart attack. Sorry. By a heart attack, which is also one of these very murky things that he died in custody. But anyhow, I mean that this. Okay, I'm sorry. He of course, like not suicide, but that this pivotal moment is currently being basically still outside how most people reason about the way that Europe militarily developed is fascinating to me. But okay, maybe let's go back to what was the point you wanted also to expand on?
Well, I could go into motive. One of the questions.
The motive. Thank you.
I mean, there are two levels. One is effect, the other is motive. First of all, again, the effect was to worsen the atrocities and to cost a much higher level of death, and this whole thing could have been settled by negotiation. That was the effect. Now the question is, why was it done this way? What was the motive? And again, the motive, I think, of the United States. And the United States clearly played the key role here, as it did in Bosnia. All right. The motive was to undercut European efforts at foreign policy independence and to establish NATO, basically, as the main international organization of importance over the EU. All right. And that the United States would remain the dominant power in Europe, and the Europeans would not go independent. And they wanted to establish this by undercutting the negotiations. It was completely successful, is the bottom line. The Europeans tried to establish their power by negotiating an end to this and demonstrating their capability to act independently of the United States. Rambouillet, of course, was the locus of this. The United States torpedoed that and then thereby torpedoed European efforts to showcase their ability to act independently. Then they brought in NATO for a war, and the war, of course, was won militarily. We defeated Serbia, which wasn't that difficult when you consider, the Serbian army compared to the, combined NATO armies is nothing. So it was a fairly easy target. It was done, by the way, with no NATO deaths whatsoever, not a single NATO death. I think one or two planes were shot down, but the pilots weren't killed. And so basically, it was a military victory. There's nothing like military victory to establish your credibility, and establishing the credibility of NATO as an alternative to the EU was very important here. And bottom line was to establish the Americans are the only game in town. You Europeans may fantasize about independent foreign policy, but that's just a fantasy. It'll never happen. And I think that's the conclusion people drew from the NATO victory, was that the Europeans will never be able to establish independence. And again, if you can't beat them, join them. And so even the French basically gave up after decades, basically, of having an independent Gaullist image of themselves. They gave up on the idea of independence and began moving towards NATO membership, which, of course, they did fully rejoin the NATO alliance after having left it in 1966. The neutrals, I think, began looking to NATO now as something they would have to consider. I think the origins of Sweden and Finland's conversion from neutrality to becoming another lackey of the Americans, if you want to put in pejorative terms. I think this was by watching very carefully what happened in Kosovo. That the only way you'll have any influence is to do what the Americans say, and maybe they'll give you some crumbs and give you some influence within that context of an American-dominated system. And so that's what came out of this, was basically to give a new lease on life to NATO and to end European talk about independence, and to ensure also that the euro would not challenge the dollar, which was a real worry, as I said. And all of this was accomplished. The Americans got every single thing they wanted. And it also gave them a certain cockiness and confidence that it's not good enough to have one war like this. You need war after war after war. You're on a treadmill here. And so quite naturally, this was only the beginning. Again, I discussed the neoconservative ideology, which is rising during this period. And this is an ideology coming out of the 1970s that is highly militarist in character. And this is increasingly seizing control of the American foreign policy establishment. And the Yugoslav wars was a great assist to this ideology, that the neoconservatives could say, I told you so. I told you force works. Some of you wanted to do negotiations. Some of you wanted to let the Europeans handle it. But look, we just completely blocked the Europeans. We used force. We got everything we wanted. It was cost free. There were no American casualties. And it was a success, or it looked like. It wasn't really a success because, again, it elevated the atrocities it was supposed to prevent. Kosovo has never really become an independent state. It's virtually a colony of NATO and the European Union. There's still the KFOR peacekeeping force, a NATO peacekeeping force, and the ULEX peacekeeping force is a joint NATO-EU peacekeeping force. And so it's a little bit like the League of Nations mandate system, whereby countries that were thought to be not sufficiently able to rule themselves were put under essentially colonial mandates. That's what we have here. And so by no reasonable standard can you call Kosovo a success. It was a disastrous failure, really. But they were able to present it as a success because we defeated the side we wanted to defeat. We imposed upon them through force an agreement, and we overthrew Milosevic in a color revolution. I don't think the term color revolution was used yet, but the techniques were all the same. So it basically, I think, laid the groundwork for the Gulf War of 2003, the war on terror, and the overthrow of Gaddafi after that. And then more recently, the US role in Ukraine. Also, I think another key factor here is, I've mentioned this before, neoconservatism is very closely aligned with Israel. And it sees Israel as a model for what the US should be. Israel doesn't rely on negotiations. It relies on force. It defeats its enemies on the battlefield. It attacks, doesn't defend. All that was very appealing to the neoconservatives. We're now seeing that playing out in the Middle East, including most recently in Iran, with American backing. Yeah. With American backing. And so I think the Kosovo War did help lay the groundwork for a whole series of further military interventions by the United States. And it gave the United States a certain complacency that military forces is risk-free. You can do it without risk. And of course, that inevitably gets you into a great deal of trouble.
Yeah, I think this is really, really important to point out. To America, this was basically the perfect proxy war. This is the way it should go, right? Because I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say that that the atrocities were then intended to happen. It's just like this is taken into as if it happens, it happens. It's war, right? That's also a constant neocon talking point, right? Collateral damage, war is war. That's what happens. But we need to settle by war, and also like that you put this this time period of the 90s, because there was of course this other very pivotal war, which was the first Gulf War, that happened at the very beginning when Yugoslavia started to crumble apart, right? And then after it finished crumbling and was completely broken up, we had the second Iraq war, the 2003 war. And in the first one, the Americans actually left Saddam in power. They didn't go to Baghdad. They stopped. And then in 2003, they didn't. They pulled the Milosevic on Saddam, right? And even then, I mean, were gleeful and happy at him being executed, right? With Hillary Clinton later on even bragging about it.
Yeah,
we saw he died. Oh, no, but that was about Gaddafi. That was Gaddafi.
That was Gaddafi, yes.
It's the same idea. The same idea. We came, saw, they died. Ha ha ha. We're so powerful.
He wasn't. Bear in mind, by the way, Gaddafi wasn't just killed There were reports he was sodomized with a bayonet, so it was a particularly unpleasant killing.
Yeah. But can you explain to yourself that in 1991, you know, the Americans had a different strategy, obviously, and then at the end of the Yugoslav wars, there seems to have been something new around. Plus, also, sorry, one more thing to mention is that today Kosovo is the home of the largest U.S. base outside of I think
Arms,
outside of Germany, right? Outside of Ramstein.
uh,
So
arms steel, yeah.
you have this huge like a proliferation, not only of NATO but of U.S. forces on the in Europe actually through these wars.
Well, I mean, basically, I see the 1990s as a kind of pivoting decade in which the United States was trying to find its footing in the post-Cold War world.
Mm.
Nobody knew what the purpose of American power was other than just to be there because it was there. Didn't really have any justification. I mean, the justification of the Cold War was to protect against the Soviets. The Soviets were gone. They were literally removed from the map. And nobody knew what NATO was for. And so the whole decade, I think, was involved in finding a new justification for NATO and for American power. And I think when in Yugoslav wars, what that did is give us certain that one of the purposes of American power is humanitarianism, humanitarian intervention. We're there to do good. We're there altruistically. America, it was claimed, didn't have any self-interested motives in intervening in Yugoslavia. It was pure humanitarianism. It was widely claimed. Um, Christopher Hitchens, who was a leftist who became a militarist, one of the leading figures, had a very cleverly worded essay in which he said, never trust imperialists until they become pacifists, with the implication that, the imperialists, meaning the United States in particular, was reluctant to intervene. We didn't want to intervene. Because we didn't want to intervene, that showed we had no self-interested motives. So when we do finally intervene, it means basically that the United States is intervening out of the goodness of our hearts. All right. And so this again was very, very appealing on the left that suddenly we're going to get uh, um, an intervention that is as pure as the driven snow, as morally pure as the driven snow. That's how it was presented. It's amazing that adults could think that way, that could believe such a thing. But that was widely believed, that this was an authentically uh, altruistic intervention and done for no reason other than, or no significant reason except humanitarianism. That's how it was presented to the public. That's how I think a lot of people, Samantha Power was a key figure here. Her book, basically A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, helped legitimate the idea that when America doesn't intervene, that shows realpolitik. That's a Kissingerian realpolitik. When we do intervene, that shows morality. All right, that shows morality. And so I think that became increasingly the view of many academics. And if you disputed any of this, it just showed you were an amoral cynic. And you could be dismissed as an amoral cynic. And so, again, this was especially popular on the left. And so the left became more militarist and more enthusiastic about war than the right. And the right increasingly became, at least some elements on the right, libertarians in particular, began moving in an anti-war position, adopting a lot of the anti-war positions that had been in the left before. You did have an ideological switcheroo here that was impressive. And it was Yugoslavia, I think, that helped enable this to happen.
Yeah, yeah, it did. And also the what you said earlier about the neutrals, that's also true. Like even Switzerland joined K4, and that was a hugely
I didn't know
debated
didn't know this
issue.
myself.
They did. That
Yes.
was hugely debated,
Yeah.
and it must be pointed out though that this is not a straight line, right? And there were these movements of history going on where, for instance, the Partnership for Peace, NATO's Partnership for Peace. Today we understand it has been used very skillfully in order to drag in countries a little by little. But at the time, especially in the early 90s, even Russia joined the Partnership for Peace, right? And there was this serious hope that NATO, might become a body for everybody. And we know that Russia also tried to join and had also this vision. Maybe, we make it into a form of an OSCE, right? We had these things, and these strains were going on at the same time, and those were possible realities or possible futures. But it morphed into something completely different. Um,
Can I just interject something there? I think one of the key problems here is America needed an enemy. It was very important to have an enemy because NATO is a military alliance. And what's the point of a military alliance without an enemy, right? And so, the enemy became in the 1990s, you know, um, dictators who oppress their own people, who persecute ethnic minorities, who oppress women. This was forged in the Yugoslavia case. Um, and later on, we found an even more substantial enemy, of course, which is the Russians and the Chinese. That's even better. But I think looking for enemy was very much a theme here in the 1990s. And it underscores how much there's almost a desperation for an enemy. And there was no need to really make Milosevic an enemy because he was willing to negotiate. And there's not the slightest doubt in my mind, having studied this very carefully, this could easily have been resolved without war. And the Americans needed. By the way, one more point about atrocities is the Joint Chiefs of Staff warned President Clinton that if NATO starts bombing, this probably the Serbs will then increase their atrocities, which is exactly what happened. So this wasn't unanticipated. This was anticipated, but it was done anyway. So there's a heavy element of cynicism here. They were willing to sacrifice thousands of people on the altar of NATO credibility. All right. And because NATO credibility was so important, getting thousands of people killed that didn't have to die was a sacrifice they were willing to make.
And it's really, I think this aspect that you're just pointing out is pivotal, and it's not just looking for an enemy, it's creating one.
Yeah.
It's narrative construction. And the interesting thing about the United States is that it has a history of understanding this danger. I mean, it was Quincy, right, who said the United States will not go out and look for monsters. And
That's right.
the Arta Moeni,
That's all you know.
Arta Moeni, who I believe you met recently, he wrote a beautiful piece together with a colleague, Chris Mott, about this constant struggle in the United States between the Jeffersonians who want to go out and do good and promote, liberal interventionism and the others, the Washingtonians, who say like, no, we better stay here, we better don't try to look for monsters. And it just seemed that the 1990s they won the.
Well, you could look at it that way. I mean, that presents it, in my view, in overly idealistic terms. I tend to look at it more cynically, that the language of altruism was a cover basically for a desire for power, and as well also to satisfy vested interest associated with military power. Military arms manufacturers, for example, were very closely connected to the foreign policy establishment. And I think that basically the humanitarianism was just a pretext to achieve a power objective, which is basically that the United States did not want to give up NATO because that was the center of American power in Europe. That's the way America controls Europe. Why would you give up the jewel in the crown of the America's overseas empire? America had an empire of bases, as Chalmers Johnson called it, bases on every continent. And why would you want to give up an empire of bases? If you don't have to. And the key problem, though, is justifying this to the public, because if you have a military alliance, you need to have an enemy you're operating against. And so, yes, creating enemies is central to this operation. And even if a country isn't an enemy, as such as, for example, Russia wasn't an enemy, casting it as an enemy and creating it as an enemy is functional to this purpose. And that's essentially what was done. But again, I think much of the narrative here, so much of this comes from Yugoslavia, and so much of the laying of the groundwork in terms of the narrative and the ideology was forged during Yugoslavia. And I really have to emphasize the sense of religious convictions. This almost was a religious war in a certain sense. That came from Yugoslavia. The tremendous fervor people feel about Ukraine, for example. That's very much a replay of what happened in Yugoslavia. The way that Putin is cast as a villain, it's almost identical to the way in which Milosevic was cast in the 1990s.
There was this moment, though, um, again, and this is also certainly no coincidence that you had these 10 years of Yugoslavia, and then once this ends, you immediately have the war against terror starting, because in a sense, like, 2000, early 2001 was again a low point for the US, right? Because again, no monsters to defeat, and then luckily there was one coming around the corner, and there's started 10 years of war on terror. But that George W. Bush, for a long time, at least when the war against Iraq started, was actually cast as a villain, but that was by the left. I remember that the left was very anti Second Iraq War,
That's
also
right.
in Europe. But then that subsided again, and
I have a theory of that as to why the big exception to this was the first Gulf War, and the left did indeed come out very strongly against that. Mass demonstrations in Europe and the United States. I participated in a few myself. Um, and in retrospect, I think the reason was this. George Bush was not only a Republican, but an evangelical Christian and a cultural conservative, and his left hated him for that reason. I'm convinced, in retrospect, that had this war been undertaken by, let's say, Clinton or Obama, there would not have been that kind of opposition. And they probably the left would have gone along with it, maybe even endorsed it with some enthusiasm. The fact that basically that war stands out is virtually the only one of this period, this whole post-Cold War period, up until the recent opposition to what's going on in Gaza. Up until then, the only major case in which the left basically took an anti-war position was the first Gulf War. And so yeah, I do see that as an anomaly. And I think the reason for the anomaly is the man pushing this was somebody the left was bound to hate, which was George W. Bush.
that also, yeah, it's but we are only starting now to be to really make also sense of this post-Cold War period, right? That this period between 91 and
That's right.
2022.
So only now being able to, we have some perspective of history to look back on it. At the time, for example, I didn't realize that the reason people were so energized about the Second Gulf War was because the person who was advocating it was somebody they just hated. I think that was the main factor. I didn't realize that at the time, but that's how it looks in retrospect. Can give you definitely a different way of looking at things for sure.
Yeah, because the Democrat presidents, again, they were very good at selling war to the
Yes,
left.
that's right.
And
Well, I think, yeah, the mass media and academia, both, I don't know, if you define left as being the Democratic Party and everything to the left of the Democratic Party, the mass media and academia are virtually all Democrats. All right. And so, naturally, they'd have much more confidence in a Democratic president. And if a Democratic president goes to war, you support the war. There's a certain tribalism that is set into American politics that's unhealthy. But there you have it.
yeah, yeah, that's good. Very good analysis, I believe. It's just depressing. It's depressing that it's that easy. It's this easy to sell war to
Yeah.
pacifists.
That's right. That's true. I mean, a sort of principled anti-war left is something you had during the Cold War with some degree of consistency. And that really is gone. I think gone for good, as far as I can tell. And I know a lot of my friends, when I point this out to them, they bristle. But, I said, think of a war beyond Iraq and Gaza, where there was an anti-war, where there was opposition to the war. There's almost nothing. So anyway,
Yeah, but
um,
it's necessary. I mean, the other wars were necessary to protect people. Therefore, it's good.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
very simple.
That's right. That's right.
Uh,
And so I think basically again Yugoslavia helped narrative construction is so important, and the narrative that was created in Yugoslavia was one that was easily transferable to other wars as well. It was just so easy to basically say, all right, we have Milosevic, who was the cause of all the problems. We got rid of Milosevic, and now, Kosovo and Bosnia are paradises, even if they're not. And so, Gaddafi, well, you just get rid of Gaddafi and everything will be just fine. You have Saddam Hussein, same thing. We have the Taliban, same thing. And so, and of course, if we just get rid of Putin, if we do regime change in Russia and get rid of Putin, well, the problem solved, right? And again, I think this was established in the Yugoslav wars in both Bosnia and Kosovo. So this really has a singular historical importance, even though it occurred 30 years ago.
this is why we have to study history. This is why we have to understand this. David, we will talk again in the near future, also about again about Yugoslavia. But for now, I would like to thank you. People who want to read from you, they should probably just find your books, right?
Yeah, First Do No Harm, Humanitarian Intervention and the Destruction of Yugoslavia, 2009.
I'll put the links into the description. David Gibbs, thank
Great.
you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, Pascal.